The night settled heavily over the small, dimly lit house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest home with weathered walls and a roof that creaked whenever the wind sighed through the dense thickets surrounding it. The ticking of the old clock echoed through the living room, where pictures of better days hung crookedly on the walls, barely illuminated by the soft, wavering glow of a single lamp. The house bore witness to moments of joy now long gone, hidden beneath the shadow of a grief that had been festering for years. Martha, a woman in her late 40s, moved quietly around the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she washed the last of the dishes. Her auburn hair, streaked with gray, fell in tired waves past her shoulders. She wore a faded blue dress and clutched a ragged apron that had seen better days. The lines on her face spoke of worry and resilience, years carved by hard work and hope that always seemed just out of reach. In the corner, with eyes as dark as night and ears alert like a sentry's, lay Brutus. He was not your typical canine hero. A mix of shepherd and mountain dog, his fur was an unusual blend of black and earthy brown, and a white patch on his chest shaped like a small, defiant shield made him stand out. Brutus's eyes carried an intensity that unnerved strangers but comforted Martha. They were windows to a heart forged by loyalty and an instinct so deep it bordered on human understanding. The quiet was shattered as the front door slammed open, hitting the wall with a force that sent vibrations through the floorboards. Tom, Martha's husband, staggered in, the acrid stench of alcohol announcing his arrival before his silhouette emerged under the dim light. His face, flushed red with anger and drink, was contorted in a scowl, eyes scanning the room like a storm ready to unleash. Brutus stood up, his muscles tensed beneath his thick coat, ears pinned forward. He didn't bark, but his presence alone was a warning, a silent challenge that spoke volumes without sound. Tom's glare met the dog's unwavering gaze for a fraction of a second before he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Stupid mutt," Tom muttered, his voice slurring as he stumbled past Brutus. The dog's eyes tracked his every move, aware of the shift in energy, attuned to the unspoken threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Martha took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to intercept Tom before his temper erupted. "Tom, please, it's late," she whispered, her voice tinged with the kind of weariness that comes from years of repeating the same plea. But tonight, there was something different. The air felt heavier, the silence more potent. Brutus sensed it. His heart pounded as if in warning. Tom spun around, eyes narrowing as he took in Martha's cautious stance. Something in him snapped, a rope that had been fraying for far too long. With a yell that echoed through the small house, he lunged forward, arm raised and fist clenched. The room seemed to freeze in that instant. Martha's eyes widened in fear, her hands raised instinctively to shield herself. But Brutus moved like a shadow, a blur of muscle and fur, leaping between Martha and Tom with a force that knocked the breath from the drunken man. A deep growl, more primal than anything heard in that house before, erupted from the dog's chest. Tom stumbled back, eyes wide with shock as Brutus bared his teeth, each one gleaming under the dim light like ivory blades. Time held its breath. Martha, still frozen, felt a tear slip down her cheek, not just from the relief but from the realization that, for the first time in years, something stood between her and the chaos. Brutus, the quiet guardian she had once nursed back to health from the side of the road, had become her unwavering shield. The shock on Tom's face quickly twisted into something darker. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the haze from both the alcohol and the sudden impact of the fall. But the sight of Brutus, standing firm between him and Martha, teeth bared and eyes unyielding, kindled a rage in him that was as reckless as it was dangerous. Tom staggered to his feet, fists clenched, his glare sharp with fury. "You think you can challenge me, mutt?" Tom spat, stumbling forward a step. Brutus did not flinch. His body was taut, a fortress of muscle and resolve, the ridge of fur along his spine bristling with intensity. For a moment, silence reigned in the room again, but this time it was tense, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Martha found her voice, thin and wavering. "Tom, please, this isn't you. Just stop, please," she pleaded, her eyes darting between her husband and the dog, her breath caught somewhere between panic and hope. She remembered when Tom wasn't like this, before life's disappointments had chipped away at him, leaving behind the shadow of the man he once was. But tonight, none of that seemed to matter. Tom's response was a guttural growl as he lunged again, this time with wild intent. Brutus surged forward, meeting Tom head-on with a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere deep, primal, and protective. The room erupted into chaos. Tom's yells mixed with Brutus's snarls as the two clashed. The wooden table in the center of the room shuddered under the force of Tom stumbling into it, sending a cascade of dishes to the floor in a shattering chorus. Brutus kept himself between Martha and Tom, using his body as an unyielding barrier. Tom's drunken blows met nothing but the empty air or the thick, protective fur of the dog. Despite his rage and size, Tom was no match for the sharp instincts and strength that Brutus possessed. The dog's growls resonated in Martha's chest, but they were not sounds of aggression. They were declarations of protection, promises that as long as he stood, no harm would come to her. The scuffle drew out for what felt like an eternity. Every breath Martha took felt like it clawed at her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Brutus maneuver, using controlled force, his eyes never leaving Tom's. There was a precision in Brutus's movements, a careful balance of asserting dominance while holding back just enough to avoid inflicting real harm. It was a dance only a protector could perform, a guardian who knew the line between defending and attacking. But Tom, blinded by fury and liquor, refused to relent. With a growl of frustration, he grabbed a chair and swung it wildly. Martha screamed as the chair arced through the air. But Brutus was faster. He leapt, knocking the chair out of Tom's hands with a force that sent it splintering to the floor, pieces skidding across the worn floorboards. Panting, Tom stared at the dog, realization dawning slowly in his bloodshot eyes. His chest heaved, and for the first time that night, fear flickered there. Brutus stood before him, chest heaving, eyes locked on Tom's with an unwavering intensity. The moment seemed to stretch, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the room. Martha, still trembling, took a hesitant step forward. "Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking, "look at what this has come to. Please, just stop." Tom's gaze flickered between Martha and Brutus, the rage in him slowly being replaced by something else, a hollow, gnawing emptiness. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. He staggered back, collapsing into the chair he had swung moments before. His head fell into his hands, and for the first time, silence returned to the room, broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing. Brutus didn't move. He stood tall, chest still heaving, eyes still fixed on Tom, but now without the aggression. It was vigilance, a silent promise that he would stand guard for as long as needed. Martha's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, tears streaming down her face as she reached out a trembling hand to touch Brutus's fur. He glanced back at her, and in that brief moment, his eyes softened, the fierce protector giving way to the gentle companion she had always known. The room, once filled with chaos, now held a fragile peace. Tom sat, motionless, haunted by his own reflection in the broken pieces of glass scattered at his feet. And in the midst of it all, Brutus stood like a sentry, unwavering, the hero no one expected but the one they desperately needed. The hours after the confrontation dragged on in an eerie stillness. Martha sat curled on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, staring into the dimness of the room. Tom had retreated into the corner, hunched over with his face buried in his hands, the weight of his own actions crushing down on him. Brutus lay close by Martha's feet, his watchful eyes glancing between her and the unmoving figure of Tom. Even in the quiet, a storm still brewed, not of fists or shouts, but of silence steeped in regret and unspoken fears. Morning light began to filter in through the window, slicing across the remnants of the night's chaos. Shattered glass, the broken chair, a dented wall. It painted the scene in sharp, unforgiving detail, exposing the rawness that hung in the air like an open wound. Martha's mind was a whirlwind, torn between the relief of still being safe and the gnawing realization that this cycle would not stop on its own. Tom stirred, lifting his head slowly as if even the movement was a burden. His eyes met Martha's, and for the first time in what felt like years, there was no anger there, only shame. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. Brutus's ears perked up at the movement, a soft growl vibrating in his chest, a reminder that the truce was fragile. Martha stood, feeling the ache in her joints, the fatigue in her very bones. She took a deep breath, bracing herself as she stepped forward. "Tom," she said softly, her voice like the wind through brittle leaves. He flinched at the sound, the weight of it hitting him harder than any blow. "We can't go on like this. This isn't living." He looked up at her, the tears threatening to spill over. For once, there was no pride or defensiveness, just a man stripped bare by his own misdeeds. "I know," he whispered, the words cracking as they left his throat. "I don't know how to fix it, Martha. I don't know how to stop." Brutus shifted, his gaze still sharp but less tense. The dog seemed to sense the change in the air, the way the hostility had dissolved into something rawer but more promising. Martha's hand instinctively reached down to brush over Brutus's head, the gesture grounding her as she stood in the middle of her shattered living room, caught between despair and hope. The moment hung heavy between them. It was as if Brutus, silent and ever vigilant, had been a catalyst not just for protection but for truth. Martha took another step, her fingers brushing the broken frame of a family photo that had fallen during the struggle. She lifted it, staring at the image of happier days, a version of Tom that seemed almost foreign now. "We need help, Tom," she said, finally breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around them like a suffocating shroud. "Real help. For you, for us." Her voice quavered, but there was a resolve there that hadn't been before, a strength born out of survival and love that refused to be crushed. Tom's eyes met hers, and for the first time, they reflected a spark of something that resembled hope. He glanced at Brutus, the dog's steady presence speaking louder than any words could. Brutus's unwavering loyalty, the fierceness with which he protected, was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still something worth fighting for. "I'll try," Tom finally said, the promise fragile but real. "I'll do whatever it takes." The room seemed to breathe again, the weight lifting just enough for Martha to feel the sting of tears, this time for a different reason. Brutus watched as Martha crossed the room to Tom, hesitating only a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of both comfort and warning, a reminder of boundaries yet to be rebuilt. Tom's head bowed, and Martha, feeling the pulse of emotion racing through her, squeezed his shoulder before stepping back. Brutus, sensing the shift, settled back on his haunches, eyes still watchful but calm. Outside, the morning sun rose higher, casting a warm light that touched everything in the room, turning the shards of glass into glistening fragments of something that might, one day, be pieced back together. The journey ahead was uncertain, the path marked with challenges and wounds that would take time to heal. But in that room, with Brutus's unyielding gaze a testament to loyalty and love, there was finally a step forward. Tom rose unsteadily, his movements slow, as though relearning how to exist in a space no longer defined by rage. He glanced at Brutus, a flicker of respect crossing his features. The dog's eyes, ever perceptive, met his with a silent understanding. Protection was earned, not given freely. And Tom knew he would spend the rest of his days trying to earn the trust and peace he had shattered. The days that followed the confrontation were marked by a quiet, tentative shift in the household. Tom sought solace in early mornings, sitting on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, staring out at the fog-draped fields that stretched into the distance. The alcohol was gone from the house, not by Martha's insistence, but by his own trembling hands as he poured it down the kitchen sink, each drop a bitter farewell to the past that had chained him. Brutus, ever vigilant, was there, a shadow at Martha's side as she went about her day. His loyalty was an anchor, a reminder that even the fiercest battles could be fought without words. The dog's eyes tracked Tom's every movement, not with the edge of aggression from that fateful night, but with cautious curiosity, as if he, too, was trying to piece together who Tom would become in the absence of anger. Martha began to find moments of peace amidst the ruins. She'd sit on the porch, knitting with a slow rhythm, the clack of needles soothing against the backdrop of birdsong and distant tractors. Brutus would lie at her feet, occasionally lifting his head when Tom approached, his tail giving a single hesitant thump when their eyes met. It was a cold afternoon when Tom made his first real step toward healing. He had spent the morning stacking firewood, the physical labor grounding him, reminding him of the simplicity of tasks done with purpose. Sweat dripped down his temples, mixing with the chill in the air. Brutus watched him from the porch, eyes half-lidded, but alert. "Hey, boy," Tom said, his voice softer than usual, cracking with the weight of a dozen unspoken apologies. Brutus's ears perked, and he stood, stretching before making his way over. Tom crouched, wiping his brow, the scent of pine and earth surrounding them. The two stood like that for a moment, man and dog, the past a silent witness between them. "I'm sorry," Tom whispered, not expecting a response but needing to say the words. To his surprise, Brutus moved closer, pressing his nose against Tom's hand, a gesture so small yet so significant that Tom felt a lump rise in his throat. He stroked Brutus's fur, rough and warm, and in that touch, something shifted, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting in a sliver of light. Martha watched from the kitchen window, her heart swelling at the sight. The lines of worry on her face softened as she blinked back tears. For so long, she had held the weight of hope alone, carrying it when it felt more like a burden than a blessing. But now, watching Tom and Brutus in the yard, the hope felt lighter, almost tangible. The weeks passed, and Tom sought professional help, a counselor in town who met with him twice a week. The sessions were hard, raw, scraping open old wounds that had long festered. But with each visit, Tom found pieces of himself that he thought had been lost forever. Brutus became a constant companion during those days, meeting Tom at the door when he returned, his presence a silent reminder that the past did not define him. Martha, too, found her voice again. She spoke up at the town's community center, sharing her story not out of shame but as a beacon for others who might be facing similar battles. She found strength in the shared nods and clasped hands of other women who knew too well the weight of silence. Brutus was by her side on those evenings, a quiet pillar of courage that made every word she spoke steady and sure. Tom's relationship with Brutus deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. The dog's initial wariness transformed into trust, and soon, Tom found himself taking Brutus for long walks along the trails behind their home. They'd walk in comfortable silence, the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot a melody that spoke of second chances. Sometimes, Tom would talk, sharing memories, hopes, and regrets, and Brutus would listen, ears swiveling at the sound of his voice, eyes soft with understanding. One evening, after a particularly hard day at work, Tom sat on the back porch, head in his hands. The temptation to reach for a drink clawed at him, the old demon whispering in familiar tones. But then Brutus was there, his heavy body leaning into Tom's side, grounding him in the present. Tom sighed, the tension seeping out of him as he patted Brutus's head. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured, feeling the fight inside him settle. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was quieter, and that was enough for now. Martha joined them moments later, a warm smile breaking across her face as she sat beside Tom and placed her hand on his. The three sat together, the remnants of a fractured past behind them, the quiet hum of cicadas filling the night air. Brutus rested his head on Martha's lap, eyes closing as a contented sigh escaped him. The path to healing was long and winding, marked by setbacks and small victories. But they weren't walking it alone. Brutus, their guardian, their silent warrior, had woven himself into their lives in a way that spoke to the unbreakable bond between people and their protectors. He was more than just a dog. He was a reminder of resilience, a testament that even in the darkest times, there is a light that will stand guard over what is most precious. Months turned into seasons, and the once fractured household began to resemble something stronger, forged through fire and healing. Tom's laughter returned, hesitant at first, as if testing the air, but soon it became a familiar sound that filled the rooms with warmth. Martha's voice no longer trembled when she spoke. It carried strength, each word anchored by the assurance that life had more to offer than survival alone. Brutus remained a constant, his steady presence a testament to the battles fought and won. The community began to notice the change. Tom and Martha no longer avoided gatherings or walked with eyes cast down. Instead, they arrived with Brutus at their side, his tail wagging as children reached out to pet him and adults nodded in recognition of the dog's silent heroism. He was no longer just the family's protector, but a symbol of resilience that touched everyone who knew their story. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves fluttered from the trees and a soft breeze swept through the yard, Martha watched Tom toss a ball for Brutus. The dog bounded after it with the unbridled joy of a pup, his powerful form moving gracefully across the lawn. Tom's eyes lit up with a smile that crinkled at the corners, genuine and unguarded. Martha felt a lump form in her throat, not of fear or worry, but of gratitude. Brutus trotted back, ball clenched proudly in his jaws, and dropped it at Tom's feet before looking up with eyes full of devotion. Tom knelt, ruffling the thick fur around Brutus's neck. "You saved us, you know that," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Brutus leaned into Tom's touch, a gentle affirmation that spoke more than words ever could. Martha stepped forward, joining them in the cool twilight. The three stood close, silhouettes against the setting sun, bound not just by shared hardship but by a love that had grown fierce and unyielding. And as the last rays of light bathed the yard in gold, Brutus barked, a single joyful sound that seemed to echo the sentiment of the moment. In that bark there was a promise. They had faced the storm, and together they had emerged stronger.